Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon, and this is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. Go to aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast, gain access to bonus content, and how to find the various platforms where the audio and video versions of the show are published. Our guest today is Dr. Isa Blumi. We have a wide-ranging discussion where we talk about the various wars within wars in Yemen and in other areas. We talk about the turmoil in Lebanon, competition between Gulf states, Europe's gas supply and the gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean, and more. And we recorded this in February, so before the invasion of Ukraine. Dr. Isa Blumi is an historian, an author, professor of global history, the Islamic world and Ottoman Empire, Yemen, and Albania. His most recent book, Destroying Yemen: What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World, tells the story of the wars in Yemen, but also, quote, ultimately tells an even larger story of today's political economy of global capitalism, development, and the war on terror as disparate actors intersect in Arabia, unquote. He also authored the book Ottoman Refugees, 1878 to 1939, Migration in a Post-Imperial World, and he has authored many academic papers. Isa Blumi is here talking to us from Beirut. Hello, Isa. It's great to talk to you. Happy 2022, and I hope this is going to be a better year. How are you doing?
Well, that's a bit optimistic, Joanne, but nevertheless, wonderful to see you in 2022. And I'd like to say hello also to your listeners and to your loyal followers. They are all making a difference in one way or the other. And, it's a great chance to...
Always requests for you, always good comments and everything. You are definitely a favorite on this show, that's for sure.
Well, it's great to be back, and hopefully we can talk a little about what's going on here in Lebanon to start with, since that's where I'm living these days, and then continue on with talking about the latest events in larger Arabia, as they are finally getting some news for all the wrong reasons, and then we can move on from there. But I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, it's a little more confusing these days to keep up with what's going on in the region. I guess a lot of our focus is now shifted to the east. That's one of the reasons, but also some of the things we've talked about in recent months, the shifting alliances, and things are definitely changing, hopefully for the better. Although I talked to Sharmeen Narwani about Lebanon last year, and so I had a bit of a sense of what the kind of turmoil there and hardship for the people who live there. So I'm also interested in what's going on. Well, I'm always interested in what's going on in the whole region, but between Syria and Israel, always interested in what is happening in the Gulf states and Yemen. So I don't even know where to start. I might have to leave that up to you, Isa.
Right. Okay. So just briefly, the problems in larger region start going back, obviously much earlier, but certainly since the Arab Spring of 2010, 2011, are continuing. The forces that contributed to that process, to, let's say, stealing away, let's say, legitimate collective action groups that had not necessarily sought a regime change, but certainly wanted to have a place in negotiation for a better long-term future. They were pushed aside very violently sometimes. But some of the same actors who were involved in that process are still alive and well and wreaking havoc to the region still today. Unfortunately for the people of Lebanon, as you probably heard from your previous guest last year, is facing an all-out campaign using the leverage over the banking industry, using sanctions that are extending from economic, financial to literally blocking Lebanon's access to the larger world in order to put and induce some kind of political change on the ground. The Americans have resorted to penalizing and punishing most of the civilians in this country in order to force them to do the work that they clearly cannot do on their own, which is to isolate, eliminate Hezbollah from being a major actor in the region. And it is a testament to just how important that group is to a wide range of people who are not just Shia radicals, but people who are across the board recognizing that there are pockets of resistance that are legitimate and deserve continued support, despite all the efforts by the United States, by Israel, to brutalize you for daring to stand up and expecting a different course of action than Washington has designated for you. Sadly, the Biden administration has returned the primary engineers for all of this chaos that has been afflicting the region since at least 2010, 2011. The same group of people, whether it be Victoria Nuland, to the Samantha Powers, to the Susan Rices, who initiated the coup in Ukraine in 2014, that now has come to the surface yet again as the cause célèbre in media in the West, apparently. This is what everyone is talking about. With the occasional reference now, because of the response on the ground from the Yemenis themselves, bringing in the story of the UAE's difficult relationship with the region itself because of their the pressure put on the UAE to invest more of its assets into reversing recent territorial successes, military successes by the resistance in Yemen, which happened already late last year and was continuing on until the first month of 2022. And so maybe that's a good way for us to have our conversation today, is to look at and remind ourselves that one of the main and important components to the events from 2010 onwards was to create a new strategic orientation to be Europe, a major consumer of natural gas, but also a one that had to import most of its consumed natural gas. And it seemed from the early 2000s to be arranged through German and Russian agreements, the creation of a Nord Stream pipeline, that Europe would be the primary beneficiary of a good relationship with Russia, which is clearly one of the main strategic concerns that the United States, at least that those groups of neocons slash Obama allies who clearly wanted to reverse that arrangement to the financial benefit of those who are going to successfully steer Europe's consumption of natural gas away from buying directly from Russia and buying it from alternative sources, whether it be through Turkey and its connections to networks in Azerbaijan. There's a reason why we've had wars between Azerbaijan and Armenia the last 2 years. It has a lot to do with creating finally a corridor for pipeline linking the Caspian Sea with Turkey and therefore European markets, extending through the Balkans, through pipelines that Turkey has made arrangements with various friendly states in the Balkans, to Israel and Turkey's attempt to secure and monopolize Eastern Mediterranean offshore, especially offshore oil and gas. Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria have large, untapped, and it's believed quite massive stores of especially natural gas that put in the frame of Europe's desperation over this very cold winter. The narrative about inflation, where prices are skyrocketing for everything from raw materials to build houses to, of course, fuel, is a perfect opportunity to get the financing necessary to build the infrastructure to exploit these devastated countries that have very low capacity to actually defend their sovereignty from the encroachments of Turkey and Israel. And that's certainly been the case with Syria. Large swaths of its territories are now occupied by Americans. Of course, Donald Trump notoriously at some point said that there's going to keep the oil of Syria, which is in the northeast corridor, and they have their assets on the ground, whether it be Daesh or various Kurdish groups servicing that purpose. Turkey is directly occupying a big swath of northern Syria to the west. And again, Israel is forcing the conditions of negotiation with a weakened, impoverished Lebanon, which really has no ability to stand up against the lawyers and the pressure coming from Washington to find a solution for its fuel problems, which in the coldest winter in the last 40 years, this last winter, it's been quite brutal here. We have electricity for 2 hours a day. And otherwise, people have to rely on producing their own electrical current, which is very expensive generators, which require fuel, which is in short supply, which has to be purchased with dollars, which is very difficult for people who do not have access to their bank accounts. They have been basically frozen. Most of Lebanese bank accounts are now closed off to the people who have money saved in them. So very much similar to what we saw in Cyprus and in Greece, where people who have cash in their bank accounts have been closed off and shut off from them. In some cases, their considerable amount of savings in Lebanese lira have worse still been depreciated because of the declining value of the lira versus the US dollar. So I'll give you an example.
They called it a bail-in at the time, right?
That's right.
But are you talking about no access to the bank accounts at all? What about daily life? Is there like a ration or of something?
Yes, they are rationed, and they can only take out in lira. And it's rationed at the official rate, which is meaningless then. The amount that they can take out doesn't buy them a sandwich, right? So this is a very cruel collective punishment, which is meant again to highlight that we will resolve this problem tomorrow if you abandon the political parties that we object to. This is the kind of message that's sent by the very arrogant American ambassador, who's often on TV here. And in the meantime, we have over 1.5 million refugees from Syria who are welcomed back to Syria, but there is a pressure to have them stay in Lebanon. They don't want people to go back and reestablish life and make Syria whole again. So there's a lot of pressure coming from the same forces to stop people from actually going back and living under government rule in Syria. It's an interesting other dynamic that often plays in these conflicts, is that where uprooted people end up living has a lot to do with the future ability of societies to reconcile and start over again. And they understand this very well. And so they want to make it a continued process of suffering, where, of course, blame is then easily allocated to those who are not responsible for this from the beginning anyways, but nevertheless, the haircut that the IMF often advises that people, working class people, are forced to accept, something that Greece and Cyprus have experienced, and something in a very, let's say, different way, many people in the United States are beginning to recognize and feel in similar ways, where their pensions, their purchasing power of their savings is being reduced by inflation that is largely either denied or it's whistled as if it's somehow a positive thing to have, spikes in prices, etc. But that's maybe leaving us too far afield, because while all this is happening in the East Mediterranean, in which Lebanon just a couple of days ago have been forced to accept a very interesting arrangement in which Egyptian gas pipelined through Jordan and even Syria, even though Syria is not allowed to provide gas to Lebanon, even though Iraq has offered to provide its oil and gas for free or in exchange for medical expertise in Lebanon. Iran has been delivering oil for the last year, again, as aid to Lebanon. All this is not permissible. Only under the terms of the United States imposes that Lebanon will now get enough fuel for another 2 hours a day of electricity. So we're talking about 4 hours of electricity is what the Americans are willing to offer at this point of crisis. So it's a very cynical, cold, cruel approach, which is very reminiscent of the Obama administration period. And again, it's largely because these people are back in power, who through Central Africa, through their encroachments in the Middle East, and their use of food politics, their use of a number of different kinds of extra, let's say, legal techniques to pressure civilian populations as much as governments. We're seeing the legacy continue on in new, and I'm afraid a more dangerous summer is awaiting ahead of us in places like Syria, northern Iraq.
Yeah, with Biden, from the start, to me, it was obvious that it's not the man. Everyone focuses on the man. I mean, he's not even, call him Biden, but it was a coalition, and I call them the worst of the worst. So it's foolish to focus on him as a person. You have to, look at who's really running the show. And as you point out, we know them. We've seen them before.
And they personally benefit from, they profit from, or their husbands or their spouses profit from the business opportunities that emerge from these kinds of conflicts. I mean, there's no better example or sets of cases to study conflict profits, how profits are made from war, than just looking at these people who are in the State Department and associated departments in American government and their allies in the EU and the UK, of course.
Yeah.
And this is one of the legacies of the Obama administration for Yemen, which has taken on a new dynamic since the late last year, largely because of initially at least, the successes of the Ansar Allah alliance in northern Yemen to push territorially back in certain key areas, but in areas that we would call our provinces of Marib and Shabwa, Shabwa. And why these two areas are important is because they are the two primary oil and gas producing regions of at least the developed resources of Yemen. There are plenty of other places where oil and gas can be developed, but they just have not funded and spent the resources to actually develop them yet. So these are the two primary areas that go back from already 1980s, when Bush Sr., as vice president, worked with Hunt Oil from Oklahoma to initiate American access to Yemeni oil and gas for the first time, in a notorious example of pressure from Washington, Bush going down there himself physically as a vice president and anointing Ali Abdullah Saleh as the man of the hour for American long-term interests, which was at that stage a simple, small company. Hunt Oil was quite modest, and nevertheless, the fields that it would acquire through these backdoor agreements, getting funding from Saddam Hussein's Iraq through the BCCI Bank in Dubai. It's all very seedy CIA stuff in the late 80s. This will initiate a whole 20-year nightmare for Yemen moving forward. And that nightmare is taking its shape once again through, funny enough, one aspect of it, American Hunt Oil again, which is still invested in these areas. But they saw in 2019 that those areas that they were busy exploiting and shipping oil and gas out of Yemen without any central government control, no tax revenue going to the Yemeni state, stealing basically Yemen's oil for the last 7 years. Hunt Oil, France, Total Oil, and there's an Austrian company, OMV. They were the three primary beneficiaries of funneling out Yemen's oil during the war.
Austrian
Well,
company?
it's an Austrian company,
Huh.
OMV.
That was a new to me. Yeah.
There are a lot of oil companies that belong to Sweden or to countries that have no oil themselves, but they're very much involved through Zurich, buying and selling oil futures, even though they don't have any drilling themselves. And in some cases, they buy the rights to develop and then distribute raw petroleum, as in this case with Austrian OMV. And the problem is that Ansarullah actually were able to secure some of these fields, and they immediately changed the dynamic on the ground. And the numbers are not available. We don't know how much they steal every day, these oil companies, but it was enough for them to get a little angry and to make phone calls. I have no doubt. And another important factor, there is the politics within this region, Shabwa, which was under the it was heavily contested between assets of Qatar, which again is an old Obama, Susan Rice, Samantha Power ally from the old days when they started this war. Again, Qatar is infamous through its media outlets, Al Jazeera, of instigating what we would call takfiri kind of sectarianism, in which one group of Muslims decry other non-Orthodox Muslims as kufar or kafir, and therefore do not deserve protection and are attacked, murdered, and forced to flee. And we saw that throughout Syria, and we did see that also throughout Yemen for the last 20 years. And so Qatar is primarily behind such groups. And their primary enemy throughout this war, throughout the last 20, 30 years, has been Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi, which is terrified by such Muslim Brotherhood kinds of groups. They know that they had cells inside the UAE and that Qatar was influencing and recruiting more troublemakers inside the UAE for decades. And so one of the main consequences of the Arab Spring, with Qatar being so successful in putting regimes into power in Egypt, Tunisia, threatening in Syria, and even successfully putting their assets in power in Yemen, was that the UAE was going to be very quickly surrounded and then threatened by expanding Qatari influence. And so it's been a war within a war within a war inside of Yemen. As I've said before on your program, and also in my book, I lay out very detailed what are the main interests of these Saudi, Qatari, and UAE rivals in Yemen. But what has happened in 2021, late 2021, is a changing dynamic on the ground because the Ansarullah had territorially won over these territories. The Biden administration, Oman, and some other actors have agreed to put pressure on these Muslim Brotherhood elements that were supported by Qatar to step aside and have the UAE and its assets move in to try to reverse these military losses. Because what was happening is that if Shabwa, this area south of Marib, is fully taken over by Ansarullah, that means Marib is basically finished. And that means the war in Yemen takes a dramatic change because there'll be no more oil or gas pumping out of the region. And Ansarullah would have a very different position in terms of negotiations moving forward. For UAE, it's important because it does not have any influence in Marib. That's primarily a Saudi, Daesh, Al-Qaeda kind of run region. It's something that borders Saudi territories. It's something that the Americans and the British have spent a lot of resources, secretly, of course, trying to protect and preserve. But in Marib, the politics is even worse than in other parts of let's say the southern parts of Yemen, which are not controlled by Ansarullah. So there's a lot of infighting. A lot of people have defected to Ansarullah from this Marib in particular. And so there's a reason why occasionally over the last couple of months, they would literally had pictures of downtown Marib from the mountains that are overlooking. So Ansarullah is very close. And so they had to reverse what was happening. And the way they did that was the UAE, which has cultivated mercenary forces, some of it which are from local indigenous population, but the majority are coming from outside, whether they be from Sudan, from Chad, and in some of these cases, including the special group called the Giants, they call their special unit called the Giants, which was very effective in securing the UAE access to the southwest port of Mocha, like the coffee, Mocha. It's where originally coffee comes from, is from this port of Yemen from the 16th century. And so they were able in 2018, using air power, but using the special forces to capture this area from Ansarullah. And they were able to go all the way up to the port city of Hodeidah, which is the most important access for northern Yemen to the outside world. If UAE were able to capture Hodeidah, the war would have gone in a very different direction. And now, the Saudis didn't want UAE to capture Hodeidah. Qatar certainly did not. But the Ansarullah also was not keen on losing their only access to the outside world. So it was a fierce fight. And in the end, even with their special forces, the UAE was forced to sign the Stockholm Agreement in late 2018, which was to pull back their forces and to keep Hodeidah as a kind of neutral zone that allowed emergency supplies of medicine and other things to the 23 million people who live in the mountains of North Yemen. In the meantime, bombing continued, air raids, the destruction of any infrastructure that exists still in northern Yemen continued, the destruction of stores of food, constantly harassing fishermen. So it's been a very cynical war, continued as such, with all kinds of interesting politics that are affecting the ability of the coalition to do anything effective against their common enemy. The problem is that they're at the same time enemies of each other. So what happened in the late 2021 is that probably with the pressure from Washington, D.C., that we and Oman, but we will make arrangements that you address and reverse these changes in those spheres of influence that you believe you have in Shabwa. And we can then force Ansarullah to negotiate on less, let's say, advantageous position moving forward. So there were reversals. Ansarullah lost quite a few soldiers, apparently, in these battles that took place in early January of this year. But again, it involved this UAE force, these giants. And I'm very suspicious about them, because if you look at them, there are some images you can find them. They're always covered. Their faces are covered. Their hands are covered. Their bodies, they're not Yemenis. You can see they're about twice the size of very skinny Yemeni types. And there have been plenty of pictures circulating of American special forces who are, especially with sniper guns, and who are clearly coordinating bombing raids from the air and drone attacks on Ansarullah. So my suspicion is that these are actually very well-paid mercenaries from Australia, from France, or other soldiers of fortune. This is one of the best markets right now for that skill set.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And so they probably helped reverse some of the dynamics on the ground in Shabwa. And the response from Ansarullah, knowing full well what is going on, probably also knowing, because they must have killed a couple of these guys, they know who these people are, is to send a message. And they sent, like in 2019, when they sent a couple drones that blew up a couple of storage facilities in Abu Dhabi airport and in Dubai airport. Look, you're playing a game now that you don't want to get into, because we will destroy your economy. Within a week, news gets around that there's no safe place in UAE. Businesses will leave. All those tourists you're trying to attract over this winter, if you go to Dubai these days, you don't need anything other than a COVID test. You don't need any vaccines or anything like that. They're trying to get as many people to come to their nice weather, to their beaches, and
And
go
then you
to
can go to
expo.
all the restaurants and shop in the malls and everything with just a
Yeah,
test.
it's to spend money. Yeah.
Mm.
It's not the same in Abu Dhabi, which is very much like China or some of the more restrictive countries like Austria, for instance. If you
Oh,
live in Abu
okay.
Dhabi, you have to have your shots and you have to have your boosters and you have your little, they call Hosna app on your phone, and it tells you whenever you're not updated with your boosters, and it flashes a color, and you have 24 hours or 48 hours to get your new booster, or you have no access to shopping malls, no access to restaurants. So it's a very different world in the UAE itself. If you are in in Dubai, or if you're in these other Emirates, which are all allied now with Abu Dhabi. So within the UAE, there's a lot of tension, and it's a very separated country. Abu Dhabi has set up checkpoints between Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So if you drive from Dubai to Abu Dhabi, there's now a checkpoint. You must show that you have your app updated. You must take a test, and then you must wait until you're allowed into Abu Dhabi. So it's a harassment.
This is a small country, right? So how much traffic is there between the different Emirates?
How much what? The question?
How much traffic? How often do people travel between the two? Do you tend to stay in your own quote unquote state, or do you go back and forth a lot?
This is the fascinating thing about the political economy of rent, of real estate. The ebb and flow of the global economy has a direct impact on the ability of these different Emirates to do fairly well. Dubai does not have oil, but it's been since the late 80s a financial hub, a place kind of like Panama where offshore banking could take place. A lot of CIA business was done through Dubai. A lot of the funding of the Mujahideen, a lot of the funding through drug money. And Dubai survives on two things. One, circulating of money, of cash, of gold. A lot of gold, world's gold goes to Dubai. And then also property development or offering investment opportunities for outside money. And the problem is there's not much money circulating around anymore. It's been like this since 2019. Many argue that COVID was a convenient moment for overshadowing the financial catastrophe that awaited the larger world that was the process of taking place. But Dubai, at various points of time, including after 2008 crisis, became incapable of paying its debts. It borrows a lot of money, and it relies on the constant flow of cash from the outside world to keep up the Ponzi scheme, if you will. And people keep getting this impression that, these fancy projects, these islands they build, the palm, the high rises, they get Russian money. These days they've been getting Kenya money or from Nigeria. They're trying to, again, attract new waves of different kinds of investors. That buzz that comes with Dubai, all those flashy ads that makes Dubai look like Las Vegas, and all these great golf performance, golf tournaments going on there. This is all to create the impression that it's a booming economy. It's a great place to invest your money. They have these golden visas now on offer. You invest $1 million, you can have a 30-year permanent residence as long as you keep your money in our accounts and that kind of thing. The problem is it's never been sustainable, and it's facing another financial crisis. So they've done the extra effort, despite COVID, to say to Abu Dhabi, we're not going to follow your rules. And so what that has done is forced Abu Dhabi, which has different political, let's say, pressure points, obvious with its agreement to formally form an alliance with Israel, to have the president of Israel, Herzog, visit recently. Indeed, the day he arrived, Ansarullah sent a couple more missiles and drones into the UAE airspace to remind the world that Yemen's war is not to be just brushed aside as the simple factor of Iran influencing a bunch of backward Shia rebels. It's a war that's affecting millions of people, and Yemenis have an ability to actually strike back. Which
So when Ansar Allah is pushing back against the UAE, who are they speaking to? Abu Dhabi?
they're saying you have really very little maneuverability here. That without the buzz that even Abu Dhabi, which is making pretty good money now off of oil again because prices have gone up, but the dollar is depreciated just as fast, if even more so. It's very expensive in the UAE generally because it imports all its food, right? It imports all its construction materials, and it imports everything. And people are trying, and they're leaving with their money. They're not staying there.
Yeah.
So even an oil-rich emirate like Abu Dhabi cannot have this sustained. And they're probably hemorrhaging a lot of money paying for all these mercenaries and all the military equipment they're forced to buy in order to satiate the demands of the American military-industrial complex, right? That's part of the agreement since the 1970s, that any revenue that could be produced and any capital and credit that can be generated from the oil industry has to be recycled back into the Western economies in one shape or form. And this is just an example of where the supply of financing is shrinking, it's drying up. UAE has this one last desperate effort to make Dubai the great destination for having a good time, for partying it up, despite the fact that there's supposedly COVID around the world. And they were successful to an extent. One will never get the real numbers about just how successful. But if you drive around Dubai, you can see there are lots of empty retail spaces. A lot of projects that have been stopped midway. You have half-built high-rises along the highways that will never be touched again because the money's gone. The people got screwed who put their money into this. You talk to some people who live in places called like International City. It's a kind of a poor suburb of Dubai. There are drug gangs fighting it out on the streets to supply all kinds of drugs that are apparently consumed. There's open prostitution of not the flashiest kind, but really the kind of street trawlers who are looking for clients. It's a pretty gruesome sight in some parts of Dubai and some of the lesser fortunate emirates. So the facade is just a facade. And Ansar Allah's response to this latest investment in trying to reverse some of the inevitable military victories of the resistance is just a reminder and a threat that everything will come tumbling down. You will have money immediately being sucked out of your economy if you don't at least agree to what you agreed to in Stockholm in 2018, which is to stay out of the politics of these battle zones that we have with Qatari assets or Saudi assets. And that was the claim, at least, that UAE, and under the Trump administration, they were highlighting this, that the UAE actually left Yemen, which of course was a joke. It's not true at all, but they tried to make a public statement that they're not actually involved in the day-to-day fighting. But their assets are. And there's no doubt that some of their assets are of Western origin, who are trained military men from various Western countries. And we know that the UAE is actively occupying these strategic areas like Socotra Island, this wonderful island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, which we know also Israelis have their military assets there. We see Israeli tourists getting a chance to go fly to Dubai, and they fly their airplane from Dubai to Socotra, and they're taking selfies now, which is infuriating for even the Yemeni allies of the UAE, that this you're flaunting that you've basically annexed some of our most important assets, which has huge access to shipping lanes. The fact that now Israel can control both aerial and maritime travel in the entire Western Indian Ocean. It must be very worrying for a lot of countries. The idea that there would be such a expansion of capacity in stealth, I think, is behind back closed doors. It's having a big effect, and it's upsetting a lot of people because Israelis are very reckless in this respect. And
Certainly not trusted. That's for sure. It's funny because I thought that the UAE was mainly focused on Aden and that port area, and I knew there were things going on in Mara, but I have to go. I got to bring out your book and look at. I always go back to review certain things. Although I had to tell you, my son said, he was interested in that book, and he has it at the moment. So I'll get another copy, or I'll borrow it. We'll share it. But anyway,
the UAE has historical links to the south through families.
Mm-hmm.
When the British ruled, or did not rule, but they, in partnership with the sultans that they selected and appointed as sultans in southern Yemen since the 1850s, up until the 1967 when they finally left, many of those families that had long cooperated with British had intermarried with the cooperative families of the Gulf, especially what they call the trucial states, Bahrain, Qatar, and what today are the 7 emirates that make up the UAE. So when the communists took power, the revolutionaries took power in 1967, throwing out the British and their assets, many of them settled in UAE and became members of the ruling families. Now, they don't necessarily have much support back in Yemen, but they nevertheless feel that Yemen is home. So a lot of these guys have grandmothers or mothers who are from Yemen. A lot of people in the military have family connections to some parts of Yemen. And that manifested in long-term investments, with Dubai Port World probably being the most notorious throughout the 1990s. Ali Abdullah Saleh was a very good ally of the UAE, and he's been propped up and was propped up even today, even though he's dead. The main television station that is his party and his nephew, who is one of the militia leaders close to Aden, they still have a 24-hour satellite TV station which constantly promotes Ali Abdullah Saleh's great vision and the relationship with the UAE as the only way moving forward for Yemen.
Which station is that?
I can send you the link to it. Here in Beirut, we get 4 or 5 Yemeni channels. None of them are from the north. They're all representing different factions of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or UAE, and all evoking horrible sectarian kind of language, which you would never have heard from a Yemeni's mouth 10 years ago. So when they interview these Yemenis now, they're talking about the Shia militia, the Houthis. And they've reduced them to just being Iranian puppets, and they have no legitimacy, and they're Shia, they're dirty Shia. It's exactly the kind of turn of discourse that took place in Lebanon and Syria in the 2000s after Hezbollah defeated Israel in 2005, 2006. Hezbollah was the most popular party in all the Arab world, and that had to be immediately reversed. And so the satellite television infrastructure that the Gulf countries owned was put into work to change how people talked about the Middle East, the resistance, and they put a sectarian spin on it, Shia versus Sunni. And so you can see it playing itself out now in Yemeni politics, which does not bode well for the future. You're seeing young adults speaking like that now. It's going to be very hard to deprogram them from just thinking off the cuffs, referring to other people on the basis of their sect, as opposed to their political ideology, or what is it today, what could be other motivating factors. It's a very troubling thing to monitor media and how the images of what images are promoted as opposed to others. It's not about unifying Yemen. Yemen is not a unified country. And so whatever final solution they'll come, if they'll come, a solution anytime soon, it's at least the ambitions is to keep it divided, to have it like a Libya that's divided to three sections, or Iraq divided to two or three sections, or Syria. So it's an old colonial tactic. It's been certainly cultivated. The technologies are different, maybe much more effective these days. And it can only be in the end enforced by violence or threat of violence, economic violence. And you can see here in Lebanon, people don't buy it. They're tired of it, and they're not going to be susceptible to that kind of coercion coming from the United States and Israel.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are starting to recognize that divide and conquer, that the regime change tactics, having seen them so often over just the last 20-year period, but certainly, going back to early colonial times. I don't know how much good that does when there's financial rewards and other kinds of rewards involved as well. Being aware of it might not be enough, but it's something.
Yeah, and that's certainly the understanding of those who are resisting, is that they need to resist, not capitulate, and very much as we are seeing in political discourse about many other things in the United States, it's getting increasingly difficult to actually have a consistently alternative understanding of things and actually have access to an audience. You get deplatformed, YouTube cancels you, Twitter shuts you down, obviously public health debates or the lack of debates over public health are the primary areas of focus now, but I'm sure regarding Ukraine, if you stand up to the very simplistic narrative that's being promoted.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
If you're a professor of Russian studies and you say, well, hold on a second. And I remember that this prominent specialist from Princeton who had the audacity of standing up and confronting the narrative. He was called a Trumpite, and he ultimately, I think, died last year. I can't remember his name, but the same thing with events here in the region. Certainly in Yemen, no one will give me a platform except for the wonderful support that I get from you and a small group of others. But you won't see in my book reviewed in TLC, in the Times literary supplements, or New York Times, or even main Middle East studies journals are not going to review my book. So I play already for several years regarding Yemen, Syria. Now it's impacting the United States. It's difficult to have a conversation in the United States anymore.
It's true. However, here's the good news.
Okay.
The traffic is still mostly for the audio version of this show, although the video version's growing. But almost none of that comes from social media, comes from Twitter. So right. we're all moving to other platforms. It's becoming a more decentralized version, which, so you don't, things are not going to go viral. It's going to be the place where the largest audience is. Nobody wants to get booted off of the YouTube or Twitter platforms which have over the last 10 years gathered, the largest audience. But there are other ones. There's Odyssey, there's now Rumble, there's Locals. There are some other ones, BitChute and No, I forget. Sorry. There are other ones. And then Rockfin, they are not censoring us for now. I mean, who knows when the pressure gets on them, that's why nobody's sort of like putting all their eggs in one basket. It's more decentralized. So smaller audience, but it's a survival strategy. So I personally think that the big platforms like YouTube, Facebook, I abandoned that a long time ago. Twitter, YouTube, they're destroying their own products. I mean, I think long term they're going to have a hard time surviving, but they'll be propped up by the state, things like that. I don't know. It's yeah, we're more in survival mode, not in sort of like making progress toward goals. But I don't know. I hope that there'll be some silver linings that will come out of it. Just the fact that we are able to do this interview with the situation that you are in, I don't know, it's a little bit of a miracle.
It is.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I should probably let you go because we're probably pushing our luck on electricity and internet connection, right?
I'm in the building where it's generated from a generator, but yeah, maybe we should leave it at that and agree to meet again soon to talk
Very
about
soon,
other
I hope.
things.
Yeah, whenever we can get the things that we need, I'm ready to jump on and do another interview at any time.
Okay, great.
I'm glad to hear
you.
that you're doing well, and good luck with the situation there. I'd like to learn more about that. I just shake my head. There are some terrible things going on here too, but nothing on that scale.
Well, now please take care, and my best to your listeners. And so, take care.
Okay. Good night, Isa. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thank you, John. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Isa Blumi. Follow Isa on Twitter at Isa Blumi. Find his work at Google Scholar and his latest book at ucpress.edu. This is a fully independent podcast. Go to aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can get access to the bonus content and support the show, and to find the various platforms where this is published, which are increasing all the time. Independent media has been increasingly targeted and deplatformed, so make sure to subscribe to different platforms. Your support is more important than ever. Go to the website to find everything you need to do that. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave reviews. All those things help. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/AroundTheEmpire. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody. Stay strong.